Until the completion of the work on Ukraine. And the debate that's being referenced is the debate on the original motion by Dr. Fry, which was amended by Mr. Genuis to delete the sentence in quotation marks in English that the committee hold no fewer than 5 meetings. So we are still on the adjournment motion. It's conditional and therefore debatable that the matter be adjourned until the completion of the committee's work on Ukraine. And the speaking order that we have on this motion at the moment is Mr. Oliphant, Madame Bandayan, Mr. Duncan, Mr. Chong, and Mr. Genuis. So with that, I will pass the floor back to Mr. Oliphant for
I will continue
resumption
simply to say that I would be against this motion to delay voting on this as a potential study to be scheduled. I think it's a study that deserves studying, a topic that deserves studying. And we have shown in this committee how we are able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have interspersed a variety of studies in starting one and continuing with other studies. And I think it's just specious to say that we should delay a vote on this until after another study is finished, when we don't even have a firm date on that study. I think we're mixing apples and oranges in this. If that's my fourth metaphor, I apologize. I think that what I like about the motion made by Dr. Fry is that it puts a stake in the ground for this committee to say that this is an important issue to study. And it's not the only issue we'll study, because there will be other motions. We have a number of notices of motion which are on the books right now. And once we get a number of motions, then we'll have a meeting where we'll look at what the priorities of the committee are to do what, when. However, because this does not have a time limit on it, it does not have a deadline set on when the study would begin or would end, I think it's appropriate for us to dispose of it quickly. So I would not be supportive of a motion to delay its vote. It's an unusual motion to adjourn until after an unknown date. I'm not even sure I would have agreed to that kind of a motion. And also adding a substantive part to that motion with respect to the number of committee meetings, I don't think is appropriate at this time within that context. So I would be voting against this motion. I think there were many comments in the lengthy speech that Mr. Genuis made that I could comment on, but I'll refrain, hoping we can dispose of both the motion to adjourn conditionally quickly, so we can get to the main motion quickly and get it done and put it into our work, our ideas for a potential work plan, and leave it till the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliphant. Madame Bandayan, please.
Merci, je serai...
Thank you very much. I'll also be brief. I just wanted to draw members' attention to this fact, and I believe my colleague Mr. Bergeron raised this earlier today, and that is that Dr. Fry had raised the issue and proposed a study on this topic in December, of course, last December, well prior to the events reported by our Conservative colleagues as the raison d'etre of our motion, and that was quite obviously and clearly not the case. And now it's been a number of months since Dr. Fry made her proposal, and we are here to vote on this motion.
I briefly respond to the lengthy intervention of my colleague on the Conservative side, simply to say that it was indeed my motion on Ukraine that was presented in January of this year. It is absolutely an important study. I would hazard to say one of the most important studies that the government is undertaking at the moment, obviously my personal opinion. But I do also agree with my colleague's comments, Mr. Oliphant, to the effect that there have been many other members of this committee, including my Conservative friends, who have argued quite the opposite, that we should be hearing witnesses on matters relating to Tibet, on matters relating to Taiwan, and many other issues, which we all agree to. And now, strangely, on this particular issue, they seem to suggest that we are not able to study Ukraine and any other subject at the same time, which is, of course, untrue. We are doing it at the moment, and we can do it again. Once again, as many have said, the motion before us does not include dates, and that will be up to the subcommittee to decide. So for those reasons, I will also be voting against my colleague's amendment.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Bendayan, pour ces...
Thank you very much, Ms. Bendayan, for your observations.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay? Is my audio okay?
Mr. Duncan, I'm advised the microphone is not selected as such. If you could just double check the connection.
You'd think I'd have this down pat 2 years in. I apologize.
That's good now. It's good. Thank you very much.
And to the clerk for advice. So I am, as you were all aware, subbing in today and participating in a committee which has been informative. We started off several hours ago with what I thought was an informative briefing, and we had committee business, a couple of motions to deal with. We're still on that, and was unfortunate that was not able to participate in camera as we were to deal with, I believe, a statement on the important issue of Ukraine. This is I'm on public accounts as my main committee, but I have been watching with interest some of the work that, of course, all of our committees do. I want to give credit to my colleague, Mr. Jennis from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, for his comments on this, and I will agree with his premise and the need to prioritize, and his amendment on which I believe is reasonable, and I believe is fair, and I believe is accurate and resembles when I try to do a pulse of our community. I think of my riding of Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry in Eastern Ontario, and based on as we get back into more normalcy and we have events backing in our community, getting a pulse of what we're hearing from our constituents on issues that they believe we as parliamentarians should be tackling and focusing on. And I agree with him wholeheartedly in his amendment that this committee needs to continue its important work on the topic of Ukraine. And I believe that it is, something that is front of mind for many Canadians. As was alluded to, I believe this motion is meant to be divisive. As Mr. Jennis and other colleagues of mine have noted, this is not the only committee that is seeking to reopen the abortion debate here in Canada. There are several committees that are attempting similar motions like this. Canadians do not want to see the debate reopened, and I think it would be incumbent, I believe, on this committee dealing with foreign affairs, international development, of when we look and survey our country of what is front of mind when it comes to what this committee's work should be. I think finishing the work on Ukraine, hearing from witnesses, working on the draft statement, I believe, which was being to be dealt with in camera today. And also, again, I think coming up with a final report of ways where, frankly, on many issues, when you look at the Conservative Party's perspective, the Liberal Party's perspective, the NDP, and the Bloc Québécois, there's been actually a strong consensus on the need to focus on this important issue, not just to the benefit of the Ukrainian people, but I believe in the bigger geopolitical situation that our country faces. Mr. Chair, one of the things that was, I've commented in the importance of this is where I believe the illegal invasion of Ukraine, and I believe the war crimes, the horrific war crimes that are happening under Putin's regime and actions. One of the things that has made this front of mind for more Canadians, and it's been able to stay rightfully in the front of our public debate and our discourse in this country, which is why I believe this committee needs to focus on it, is that, and I can perhaps compare, as I know there is, unfortunately, sadly, the Afghan committee that was supposed to be hearing tonight from interpreters was canceled as a result of this, which is unfortunate. but it speaks to where I believe in the situation of what we're seeing in Ukraine, with the evolution of technology, the evolution of social media and our smartphones that we have, Canadians in real time, whether it be on Facebook or on Twitter or on Instagram, on TikTok or other forms of social media, they've now seen firsthand in a near live time the atrocities that have been happening, the unjustifiable, horrific actions by the Russian regime. And so now I'm amazed. Just as an example, as I was saying, we were getting out into our communities more. We are hearing. I was at in Morrisburg at the South Dundas Trade Show. It was a great way to get a pulse of the community there for 2 days and unfiltered feedback, good, bad, or indifferent from constituents on issues or topics that are important to them. It gives you a chance to understand what's resonating. And the number of people that I spoke to over the course of the day and a half at that event, it was incredible the number of people that were more knowledgeable about perhaps the geography of Ukraine, but again, the geopolitical aspects there, the humanitarian aid that Canada needs to provide and continue to provide, lethal weapons as well. And I'll get into that a little bit as well of why this issue continues and should be front of mind. But it's, the first, I call it illegal invasion. It's towards an illegal invasion has gotten so much attention because people have seen it in live time. They've seen the videos. They've seen the bravery and determination of the Ukrainian people in fighting back against these horrific acts. And we're talking, as is mentioned, and I know numerous colleagues from all parties again, of where there's been consensus on the urgency and importance of this is war crimes that are being committed and numerous unacceptable actions by Mr. Putin. When we look at the issue of Ukraine and the topics that we need to cover, it is very multifaceted, and why this committee should be prioritizing that work, ensuring that this is dealt with. We're hearing from witnesses, we're making recommendations. And again, I actually say it from a constructive perspective in the sense that I believe parliamentarians are pretty well united in terms of a lot of the approaches and the topics that we need to take. When we talk about humanitarian assistance in our foreign aid and being able to provide that, I think the access to providing and equipping the Ukrainian military with lethal weapons, I think is absolutely essential, and making recommendations in this timely manner of how we can better do that as an international community, how we can best do it as Canadians. And one of the things as well that I think is especially important, Mr. Chair, too, is the compassionate grounds that Canadians, as always, have stepped up to offer help. I'm amazed, again, when we talk locally, I have to admit that very often foreign affairs topics, international jurisdiction, may not always be the front of mind to all Canadians. But again, I think what has been happening in Ukraine, and again, the manner in which it's being able to be communicated, and just the atrocities of it, and the unbelievability and the evil that we've seen in these actions, more Canadians are versed in this. And I've been amazed over the course of the last while. And again, I've seen a growing interest from Canadians as we talk about this topic of how they can help support refugee and humanitarian efforts, as particularly women and children are attempting to relocate to Canada. A few things when we deal with that is what the committee can do to better resettle. And again, we have a few Ukrainian families that have arrived into my community in rural Eastern Ontario. One of the things that we've heard from that is the disorganization and the frustration around paperwork processes, access to flights, the confusion and some of the chaos, frankly, around that. We saw that last year during the Afghanistan crises, the evacuation of numerous Afghanistan citizens, those that helped us in our time of need while being in Afghanistan. We saw absolute chaos and disorganization. And Mr. Chair, I think the reason why this needs to be front of mind and continues to need to be a conversation for our committee is that there is more work to be done. There are certainly recommendations. There are witnesses that we need to hear from the NGO community, from a governmental perspective, departmental officials, international organizations, and those that are on the ground about how our response as Canadians can be improved. And I certainly think one of the things we could agree on is that the more timely we make that, the more we hear those voices at committee, the more we get that testimony, make recommendations, I think could positively pressure the government, the bureaucracy, NGOs, and I think other, frankly, even beyond in the international community, the opportunity to, I think, be constructive and be united as a Canadian Parliament, regardless of which political party. Again, there's been a lot of support for this. I think the committee needs to be focusing on that and addressing that. One of the things as well, Mr. Chair, another angle is we talk about the economic aspect. And one of the things that I believe the committee needs to continue to tackle, and why the sub-amendment I support and will continue to support the principle of it and the importance of it, because that's what I'm hearing. And I know many of my colleagues, and I think frankly around the country, we're hearing about the need for this, is the energy policy and energy dependence that far too many countries in Europe have and a reliance with Russia. And we've had motions and we are trying to get on record and pressure the government to be more aggressive on this. And I will say, for as constructive as my comments have been in the unity, Mr. Chair, there has been on many of the aspects I mentioned before, when it comes to the role that Canadian energy can play, I think in destabilizing a war machine in Russia, there actually, unfortunately, has not been as much agreement on that topic. But I think it's important to have the time at committee to really study and look at that aspect of that relationship and how our Canadian energy, whether it be on our East Coast or whether it be in the West, that can be used to, I think, in the short term, destabilize the economy, rightfully so, of Putin and his regime and his oligarchs. But I also think in the longer run as well, Mr. Chair, we can look at how we can support our Canadian economy here that helps to support causes along, not just in Ukraine, but around the international community. And I also think as well, when we could take a look at some of the economic aspects, this could help, I think, in the long run of what we do and how we do it in terms of sending a message to other regimes that have similar, horrific actions they've undertaken, like Russia has taken, that the world is watching, that Canada is watching. Canada can step up. And this is a way that we can do more. We need to have attention on this, of how our actions and how our resolve could actually, I think, improve the situation, resolve the situation better, particularly in Ukraine in terms of destabilizing the Russian economy and government revenues on that. We need to have more of those debates and more of those understandings. And I think that will be a benefit to our committee, a benefit for Canadians to understand the role, not just a commitment or a verbal commitment, but there's tangible actions economically that can benefit Canadians. I think, frankly, they can benefit the environment. We have an energy sector here in this country that is second to none around the world. I will put up the workers, I will put up the companies, I will put up the trajectories and the plans of our Canadian energy sector any day of the week, any month of the year against any other country in the world. There's a commitment to human rights. There's a commitment to the environment. And I think you could actually see both of those issues better addressed if we saw more support domestically for our sector, as opposed to phasing it out and all the negatives that you see, embracing the technological advances, and not only, again, helping domestically, helping environmentally ourselves and those around the world. I believe from a human rights perspective, it could stop sending dollars to countries that do not deserve that revenue, that growth, that support through that means, that are turning around and doing the devastating actions that we're seeing unfold day after day, week after week, and unfortunately now month after month with what is happening in the situation in Ukraine. One of the other things, Mr. Chair, that I think is important and why this sub-amendment is important, to ensure that the focus and the attention continues to be not only for ourselves as the committee and as Parliament through the committee's work, but the message it sends to the international community and particularly the business community as well, Mr. Chair. It was timely today, and as I was participating in the meeting earlier, I will acknowledge I was paying attention as I always do, but getting caught up on news. And I was timely today when we talk about the economic impacts of how numerous businesses, international corporations, businesses of all types are receding and closing their relationships with Russia. Many had done so on a pause basis, as a short-term basis to see exactly what's going to happen. But I've been impressed by the number of businesses. There are far more that need to happen in the coming weeks and months, and frankly, in years to make sure that we don't go back. There needs to be serious long-term consequences. This is an issue and a topic, and the actions we've seen from Vladimir Putin and his thugs over the course of the last couple of months, particularly, we need to make sure that the message we're sending, not only in this instance, but for future acts of inappropriate and unacceptable aggression, do not go unanswered. And the reason, again, or I get to that, Mr. Chair, was there was an article just published today, this afternoon, right, probably around midday, from BBC News with the headline, "McDonald's to leave Russia for good after 30 years." And it said now in the article that was published by Becky Morton again today, that McDonald's has said it will permanently leave Russia after more than 30 years and has started to sell its restaurants. And it's going to have a significant, I mean, as these temporary measures that were done by several in the business community internationally, it's going to have a continued ripple effect and a continued consequence, which I think is positive. It comes after it temporarily closed 850 outlets in March. And the fast food giant said it made the decision because of, quote, the humanitarian crisis and, quote, unpredictable operating environment caused by the Ukraine war. Now, it notes that McDonald's has had a relationship with in Russia, or had operations, I should say, in Russia since 1990. And that was meant as to symbolize a thaw in Cold War tensions. A year later, the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia opened its economy to companies from the West. More than 3 decades later, it is a growing number, is one of a growing number of
Point of order, Madam. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Duncan, let me pause you for a moment here. We've got a point of order. Sure. Please go ahead, Madam Bendayan.
As much as I'm enjoying this lengthy filibuster, I would like to make a point of order based on relevance. I understand that the amendment on the floor is with respect to Ukraine, and as much as I congratulate the member for having read the news today about McDonald's, I think we are veering way off topic. The motion that we are discussing and the amendment that we are discussing is about pushing off women's reproductive rights study and not McDonald's. And so on a point of order on relevance, sir.
I'll take the point under advisement, Mr. Duncan. It's on the margins of relevance. I think it is still tangentially relevant because it is about the dynamics in Russia. But if you could keep your arguments as focused as you could on the motion itself, that would be appreciated. Thank you very much.
Perfect. And again, to relevance on this, happy to provide a refresher to the member of how this is connecting to relevance. Happy to do so. In the sense, as I've mentioned, the importance of the sub-amendment introduced by my colleague, I believe, is a valid one because of I'm trying to demonstrate the wide variety of topics on the subject of Ukraine that I believe this committee needs to continue its work on. Mr. Chair, as I mentioned before, the humanitarian aid that the Canadian government has provided, needing to provide lethal weapons, needing to improve our refugee and immigration process for those who are fleeing Ukraine and are looking for safe haven in Canada. I've talked about the Canadian energy sector and the importance on this topic. And as I was alluding to the article here, and I'll get to it again, just showing some of the relevance of the economic factors here and the importance of where I'm going. And again, I don't mean to, as we've been in the committee meeting here for several hours, talk about food or McDonald's as much, but the seriousness of it is, in getting to this, is that a corporation today, just an example, in their case, making news of a significant commitment to remove itself from its operations in Russia. We're seeing numerous corporations, numerous businesses do that. They're looking for continued leadership and direction from countries like Canada. And just the example today, the corporation said they were going to write off charges up to $1.4 billion they are going to absorb themselves and write off.
Mr. Chair, a point of order again. I'm going to interrupt because this is no longer relevant to the sub-amendment, and the fact that this member is now preventing our committee from voting on this motion is getting a bit ridiculous.
Point of order. I think you've already ruled on that, Mr. Chair, but happy for you to do so again.
I think what you were trying to do, Mr. Duncan, is to establish why your initial comments that were challenged were being relevant. I would encourage you to finish that point and then return to the thrust of the motion if you could. I will sustain your comments as they are given to us.
And as I was saying, again, the economic context here of where I think there are numerous corporations around the world that have tentatively and at different levels have suspended their economic relationships with Russia. And then that needs to continue over the course of the next couple of months. They're looking for continued leadership on the long term. And I think my point that I'm trying to raise, Mr. Chair, which is relevant to the sub-amendment of ensuring that this committee continues to put focus on an issue and a topic that is important to many Canadians, and that is the illegal and horrific, unfair invasion by Vladimir Putin and the regime there. It's important. I go back to the economic aspect of where there are billions of dollars that are left up in the air that I believe need to permanently leave, like we saw in the news article today. And actually, the article does reference numerous other corporations that are looking to wait to see what not only the short-term aspect has been, but the medium-term and long-term aspect of it. And Mr. Chair, I think from the committee's perspective as well, when we go back and look at the larger aspect and mandate here, the geopolitics of the region, not only does it have implications between the two countries right now, as we're all aware of the ripple effect of not confronting this issue with the emphasis that we've seen. We've seen a solid response from the international community. But I think, again, the committee's work needs to continue on this aspect because of it's not just Ukraine that is in Russia's sights. You look at Poland, you look at Baltic states, we look at the news, the relevant news that I believe the committee would be interested in as an evolving topic of this was the announcement this weekend from Finland and Sweden of their request to urgently join NATO and become partners there. And we're seeing a snowball effect of moving here of where there's been conversations and doubt and perhaps a lack of political will from different factors for several years about those two countries specifically joining NATO. I've been following with interest that of making sure that is timely, making sure that information is there. And actually, again, when we talk about the importance of the sub-amendment of having the committee focus and concluding its work on the topic of Ukraine, I think that is recently, just as this past weekend, provided relevancy to the committee, relevancy to the topic of the importance of focusing and hearing from witnesses and topics on the subject of Ukraine. And there are other countries around the world, unfortunately, with perhaps similar negative intentions, watching to see how the international community responds, or in many cases does not respond to the challenges and in the horrible actions we're seeing by Russia. And I think of China, and we've talked in, I believe, later this week, the relationship with Taiwan and the connections that are there. So, Mr. Chair, I believe that, as I say, maybe not every Canadian is watching the House of Commons Committee on Foreign Affairs, but I know there are a lot of countries, like-minded countries around the world that are not going out seeking to reopen the abortion debate, that are looking to create division. And we see that, Mr. Chair, and I say that because there have been numerous attempts by members to implement and institute several different aspects here in terms of trying to raise these types of motions at a wide variety of committees and cause, I believe, change in directions of all this. I believe it's incumbent on this committee, and I've appreciated, yes, I'm not a regular member, but having been here for several hours today, listening to the discussions from all the party members, I wanted to make sure that I was on record for the sub-amendment. the emphasis and focus, and again, bringing the views of my constituents, and I believe of millions of Canadians, that if they had the opportunity to understand what this committee should be tackling and discussing, it would be the issue in concluding the meetings, the testimony, recommendations, and next steps of how Canada can improve its response to the very real challenges facing the brave and wonderful people of Ukraine. So with that, I will, I believe I have my colleague, Mr. Chong, next, but I appreciate taking a few minutes while here at committee today, which has turned into tonight, but getting on record because I believe it's very important that the sub-amendment be considered as an issue and in the relevancy and the focus of the committee as the work of the committee continues in the last 5-6 weeks, sitting weeks that we have here in Ottawa. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Duncan, thank you very much. We have on the speakers list at the moment Mr. Chung, Mr. Genuis, and then Mr. Davidson. Mr. Chung, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be voting for Mr. Genuis's motion because I think the main motion introduced by Dr. Fry concerns me. I think we need to have some offline discussions about what the nature of that 5-meeting study would be before we agree to it. The way I read the original motion introduced by Dr. Fry is that it says that if it is adopted, we are going to study, amongst other things, access to abortion in the United States of America, which I do not think we as a committee should do. Clearly, I'm not alone in my interpretation of the motion introduced by Dr. Fry because I've listened to the debate on that motion very carefully throughout today, and clearly others on the committee have interpreted the motion in the same way, which is that if the motion is adopted, it would include a study on access to abortion in the United States. And I do not think that is a matter this committee should be seized with. It's why earlier in our debate today, I moved an amendment to strike the reference in the motion to the recently leaked draft ruling from the Supreme Court of the United States, an amendment that did not pass. So as I've said, I don't support this committee studying access to abortion services in the United States. I think that there are many more matters of more urgent concern in the bilateral relationship between Canada and the United States. I want to be clear, I fully support women's reproductive and health rights here in Canada, and I support the current common law and legislative frameworks that have long been in place. And I know with great deal of certainty that Canadians do not want the debate on abortion here reopened. We don't want to import into this country the kind of fractiousness that we have seen south of the border on issues like abortion, which is another reason why I don't think we should be studying the issue of access to abortion in the United States in this committee. Look, I support this committee studying access to abortion services, access to women's health and reproductive services in the Global South. I think that's well within our remit to study. I think it's well within our remit to study the list of health issues that Dr. Fry has put into her motion. A full range, I think it's worth studying a full range of health services, including family planning and modern contraception, comprehensive sexuality education, safe and legal abortion and post-abortion care, laws restricting or prohibiting women's rights to abortion, and the medical and socioeconomic importance of maintaining the right of access to safe abortion and prevention and treatment of HIV/AIDS and sexually transmitted infections. I think that's all within the committee's remit, provided that it focuses on countries that Canada has traditionally provided aid to in respect of those services. That does not include the United States of America, our largest trading partner and ally, and I don't think the study should include that, which is why I moved the amendment earlier to strike the words, quote, given recent reports of international backsliding related to women's sexual and reproductive health and rights, end quote. Clearly, that was a reference to the recently leaked draft of the Supreme Court of the United States. And I don't think we should be importing that kind of divisive politics into Canada. And so for those reasons, I don't support this committee studying that issue as it relates to the United States. There are so many other issues of concern to Canada-U.S. relations that are more important than access in the United States to abortion services. Line 5 is one example. It supplies half of Ontario and Quebec's gasoline, diesel, propane, and jet fuel. Half. And
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Now we seem to be discussing line 5 when what we are supposed to be discussing is a motion on the reproductive rights of women and the amendment that has been put forward by our Conservative colleague.
Point of order.
Mr. Chong,
on that point of order, Mr. Chair, respectfully, we're hearing a lot of points of order from that member when people are making comments that are relevant on the motion. I do notice there's a lot of discussion happening on the Liberal side at this concurrently while people are talking. So I do want to respect the fact that maybe it does create some issues in terms of people being able to hear what speakers are saying. But Mr. Chong's comments, Mr. Duncan's comments were highly relevant to the question of whether we should be the adjournment should proceed. And I hope that members will listen to your rulings rather than continually, repeatedly bringing up the same issue.
Mr. Chair, in response to that colleague's intervention, I was speaking to absolutely nobody. I was listening to the intervention of Mr. Chong. This is my third point of order on relevance after hours of filibuster on a very important motion. And the 2 points of order on relevance in relation to McDonald's were valid, and the point of order in relation to line 5, in my opinion, is valid. And of course, Mr. Chair, you're free to rule as you see fit, but neither of my points of order earlier nor this one right now is in any way out of line.
Thank you very much, both of you, for the comments. I think the members are free to raise points of order and to question relevance in the context of a discussion, any discussion. I think Mr. Chong had a point that was tangentially relevant. He was maybe trying to establish how it is relevant. The motion before members, as you all know, is that debate be adjourned until completion of Ukraine. And I think he was trying to make a point with respect to the original motion that dealt with the U.S. If you can show how that's relevant directly to the motion before the committee, I will allow it. And just in terms of the dynamics generally, I think it's healthy for members to raise a point of order now and then just to make sure the direction of the committee discussion really stays focused on the motion that's before the committee. I don't want to necessarily have the discussion be too truncated by points of order that are just there to change the flow, but it's completely within members' discretion to raise a point of order as they see fit, as it is for members that are speaking to defend how their points are relevant. My own ruling could, in any particular case, could go either way and could be challenged. I see my role as more guiding the general discussion onto the subject of the motion. Mr. Oliphant.
On that point of order, and I may have forgotten now, but it seems to me we dealt with an attempt to change the motion. There was an amendment to cut out the whereas clause per se. Did we not vote on that already? You'll have to,
I'll have to check.
There was a motion, an amendment made to strike the first clause with the argument made that it was inferring United States, and Mr. Chong wanted it out. He is now trying to raise an issue that has been dealt with by this committee. Therefore, I would ask the chair to absolutely rule it out of order as something the committee has dealt with, not in the recent past, in the last several hours. So that's the point. It's not relevance. It's actually against the rules of the committee to try to litigate an issue that has been dealt with in the very recent past. You might want to check with the clerk, but I think I'm right on that.
Just on the same point.
I appreciate that point of order, Mr. Oliphant. It is a different point of order. It is more focused. I wasn't part of the discussion when that vote took place, but we can certainly verify whether or not that point was effectively extinguished by the committee having pronounced itself on that very issue. But I'll take a comment on that same point of order from Mr. Genuis.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, just as a matter of procedure, I am not aware of any rule by which the fact that the committee has voted has previously voted on an amendment to the main motion somehow renders arguments in relation to the main motion that are derived from that same point as no longer acceptable. I'm not familiar with any precedent, and again, happy to hear from the clerk on this, that would say that because the committee voted against an amendment for Mr. Chong previously that dealt with one section of the main motion, that somehow he's not able to discuss that section of the main motion. What we're discussing right now is a motion to adjourn debate around the motion. And so the question of whether or not to adjourn the debate means that questions of the adjournment motion itself, as well as the original motion, which we are seeking to, which the motion seeks to adjourn debate on, are all relevant. But the implication that you can't reflect on a matter that has previously been voted on by the committee, that's just not a rule. It just isn't. Thanks.
Mr. Genuis, thank you very much. I think one of the points would be to argue that this goes to repetitiveness, in the sense that if we're within the same line of discussion, the same arguments should not be made. You raised a good point, because that was procedurally done under a different motion at a different time of the committee. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to check, first of all, if the committee did in fact vote to extinguish, not extinguish, but to settle that point, and then what the implications of that decision would be with respect to the motion that's currently under discussion. If you can just stand by for a moment. Okay, I hope that I'm able to provide some clarification. Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. So the committee did vote on this point that was brought by Mr. Chong earlier, and voted against the amendment. That took care of the issue. What that would do is foreclose the opportunity for a member subsequently to resurrect that same amendment or that same argument in the form of a new motion and try to do again what the committee has already pronounced itself on. The repetitiveness point is one that members generally should keep an eye on in the conversation, but it generally extends only to the line of discussion that is under the motion that is before the committee. So if Mr. Genuis or Mr. Chong or Mr. Oliphant were to make arguments, or anybody else for that matter, under that same motion repeatedly, that could be challenged by members on a point of order, because repetition in that case would be against the rules. I hope that's helpful. And,
Mr. Chair, just a follow-up point of order. I respect your position, and so I don't want it to come across that I'm questioning it, but I'm more just seeking clarification. What I understood you to say, and this is consistent with my understanding of procedure, is that the fact that the amendment was defeated means that same amendment cannot be moved again. Mr. Chong is, of course, free to point out the fact that his amendment not passing is a primary reason for him continuing to have concerns about the motion and therefore not wanting to support it in general. It's fine to make that argument. It's just he cannot move an identical amendment as his previous amendment.
That's correct.
That's
correct.
correct. Okay.
And again,
right.
members are free to raise points of order challenging. We're free to review and to assess. And I encourage all members to just stay focused on the motion under discussion.
Well, thank you. That's consistent with my understanding of the rules, so I appreciate that.
With all of that, Mr. Chung, please, back to you.
Chair, just to clarify, were my remarks, or were they not, in order?
Yes, Mr. Chung, they were in order.
Thank
I just
you.
encourage you that you're in the threshold of tangential relevance to just stay focused as much as you can.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you. So as I was saying, I don't support this committee studying access to abortion in the United States, which is why I support Mr. Genuis's motion to adjourn debate on this motion, so that we can hopefully, on the sidelines outside of this committee, sort this out. And as I was saying, there are many more issues more important in the Canada-U.S. relationship than abortion. I mentioned Line 5, which supplies half of the energy to Ontario and Quebec for some 24 million consumers in these two provinces. It's at risk of being shut down at any point in time because of what's going on in the U.S. federal court. We have the issue of dairy imports that continues to be an ongoing issue for many, many dairy farmers in both Ontario and Quebec. We have Buy American issues. We have the entire modernization of NORAD, which could cost upwards of $10 billion US dollars. And so I don't support this committee looking at access to abortion in the United States. I don't think that's within this committee's remit. I support us taking a look at women's reproductive and health rights, including access to reproductive services in the Global South, because that is within the remit of this committee. Canada funds a lot of foreign aid, much of it in the Global South, and I think it's well within our committee's responsibility to take a look at that, which is why I tried to move that earlier amendment, which was not passed. And so, just to finish, Mr. Chair, I believe the reason why we should adjourn debate on the motion introduced by Dr. Fry is that I don't believe this committee should be studying access to abortion in the United States. And for that reason, I support the motion in front of us. And for that reason, I do not support the motion introduced by Dr. Fry. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chung. And over to Mr. Genuis, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to join the debate again and to make some follow-up remarks with respect to some of the things that colleagues have made, that colleagues have said. So I'll start just by reflecting on that. The main thrust of my remarks was to say, look, this committee has a finite amount of time. The House of Commons has a finite amount of resources. We deal with scarcity in all areas of life, and one of them is the work of parliamentary committees. And that means we have to make choices about priorities. We can't just say we're going to just do all of it, and there's no such thing as scarcity. I'll share with members that I sometimes have questions about the way that the scarcity of House resources seems to be selectively used in certain situations, and I think members of Parliament should have access in the form of committees to be able to sit when and for however long they want to be able to deal with issues, to be able to add extra meetings and so forth. But that is just not the reality of how this place has operated. So we do have to make choices in the face of these scarce resources between different topics that are up for consideration. That's not even about constraints that exist on our schedule. That's about constraints that we are told are just a function of the structure of the way this place, the House of Commons, is operating right now. As over the course of this debate, we have therefore made the argument that the priority of the Canadian Foreign Affairs Committee should be the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that we should not displace the possibility of further discussion of the invasion of Ukraine to replace it with discussion that reflects the desire of some interests in the PMO to reopen the abortion debate at every, or at least most, parliamentary committees. We are already seeing the impact of that scarcity even today. Our position was that we should adjourn debate, we should have discussion in the subcommittee about how this and other priorities of the committee are scheduled, how they proceed. And the government consistently refused to support that. Now, the consequence of that was the whips of other parties deciding that the Afghanistan committee that was supposed to meet tonight and hear from interpreters would be canceled. And that is a mighty shame, given that interpreters who served Canada were going to be here to have their voice heard. Now,
point of order, Mr. Chair.
Repeatedly tried.
1 second, Mr. Genuis. Madame Bandet, please.
I also find it extremely unfortunate that the Afghanistan committee was cancelled this evening, but it was due to the filibuster engaged in by that colleague. And I would argue that the lack of relevance to the motion and the amendment to the motion that we are debating is flagrant at this point, Mr.
I think we're getting into the question of debate, and I'm sure Mr. Genuis will establish the relevance, so we'll let him go. But with the message generally being to stick as closely as you can to the
Thank you.
of the motion.
I do think it's revealing when a member says they have a point of order and uses the words "I would argue" in the context of a point of order. That should maybe indicate that it's not a point of order.
I apologize. The point of order is on relevance. Please stick to the motion. That's the
let's
point
keep
of order.
colleagues, please, and instead of talking over top of each other, let's keep order.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have sought to adjourn this meeting and proceed to allow the Afghanistan Committee to do its work. In fact, this is why we said prior to 6 o'clock that we would be prepared to let the debate collapse on this entirely. And it was Liberal members, and the record will show at 6 o'clock that it was Liberal members that talked this through past that time, and therefore ensured that the Afghanistan Committee would not proceed. But regardless, the important point is to respond to the arguments made directly by Mr. Oliphant and Ms. Ben-Dayan, who said essentially, "Hey, this committee can do lots of things at once. We can walk and chew gum at the same time." Let's just reflect on that metaphor a little bit, because the reason people say you can walk and chew gum at the same time is because you can, because those are activities that don't involve the same organs. Chewing gum involves your teeth and walking involves your legs, right? But a committee cannot simultaneously study two different issues in the same meeting. It cannot. It has to, of course, it can study one issue, one meeting, one issue, another meeting, and back to the other meeting. But it very clearly can't do those things simultaneously. And so we have to weigh out, some colleagues are speaking to me. I invite them to get on the list or raise points of order, or we can suspend and have a side conversation about this. But otherwise, I'll just continue. Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. Look, if members of the government believe that there isn't such a thing as scarcity of resources, well, I'm sorry. That's just missing out on the reality of how this place has worked. The fact that today, if this motion hadn't been moved, or if there had been agreement to take a step back from it and have discussion on the side about it, we could have, in fact, been having the conversation that we should have had on the statement with respect to Ukraine. We might well have adopted that statement. We might have released that statement. We might have tabled a statement in the House. I would have been in favor of us giving analysts some direction on developing a report on Ukraine, because we're in the middle of a study on Ukraine. And what I'm saying is, let's get back to the vital work we need to do on Ukraine. But for members across the way to say it, we can do all these things simultaneously. We can be on this half of the room doing Ukraine and on this half of the room doing something else. Well, no. I mean, that's just not how it works. We need to set priorities. We need to say what are we going to prioritize as a committee, and if we're going to prioritize the issue of Ukraine, then we need to set aside the time to hear from witnesses, to renew our information as there are new developments on the ground, to discuss the many other emerging issues that we have not discussed, and then to move from there to the question of releasing statements, of writing reports, interim report, final report. We can make that decision as a committee about how we move forward. The other issue, there were some other statements that were made by government members in response to our conversation on this that I think are, I don't know if I can say misleading but inaccurate. I'm sure well-intentioned, but inaccurate. This motion was characterized as an idea for a future work plan. This isn't an idea for a future work plan. This is a highly prescriptive motion that says we are going to study a particular thing. And that is, in the nature of the way the world works, a parliamentary committee studies one thing at a particular meeting at a particular time, right? And so this is to say that in the midst of Ukraine and everything else that's going on, we should study, they are saying, abortion. And we're saying in the context of this adjournment motion in particular,
Okay. Mr. Genius, there's a point of order. We have once again bells, colleagues. It's a 30-minute bell that would take us on this clock till about 8:10 to even get to the vote. Sorry, 9:10. We've got resources until 9:30 with an absolute hard stop. So that would leave us at best 10 minutes after we come back from this vote. If colleagues agree, it's clear that there's going to be more discussion on this. If colleagues agree, I would suggest that we suspend for the evening until our next session, whenever it is. It may be as early as tomorrow, it may be on Thursday, and that we resume with the speakers list that we have now, which is Mr. Genuis, Mr. Davidson, Mr. Duncan, and Ms. McPherson. Is that agreeable?
Mr. Chair, I would suggest we adjourn as opposed to suspending. But
I don't think we have consent for an adjournment.
well, happy to suspend for the night as well.
We will suspend until our next session.
Did we adjourn? Did you say? No.
Okay, colleagues, meeting adjourned until our next session. You tripped me. Meeting suspended until our next session. Bonne soirée. Merci beaucoup. À la prochaine.